In this video, I'm going to discuss when beams do not need stirrups. Um, I advise against doing this. The stirrups don't cost that much. I would put them in, but you are allowed in beams to not have stirrups if this is true. If phi VC over 2 is greater than VU, you don't need any stirrups. This is not the same as Vs equals 0. If Vs equals 0, meaning no stirrups, you would think that phi Vc, remember Vn is Vc plus Vs, so if Vs is 0, you would think if phi Vc is greater than Vu, it's okay to have 0 for Vs. It's okay to have 0 for V steel, no stirrups. But the code is conservative. You have to have phi Vc greater than 2 Vu. This says that if your concrete strength is twice as much as needed, then you can omit the stirrups. But I still think it's not a wise idea to do this. Let me tell you a story from earthquake reconnaissance trip I took to New Zealand. We were reviewing buildings that have survived, and typically in these beams, they would survive if they had enough stirrups. They could have additional shear strength, and we know from the history of the code, we can judge the era of the beam based on what we saw. And we came across a number of buildings that had survived. The concrete cover came off. We could see the spacing of the stirrups. And it was obvious from those details that the beams were post mid-70s, 1970s. We got back and looked at the inventory of the buildings, which had design and construction dates, and they were pre the code requirements for closer stirrups. And so we said, no, something must be wrong. These buildings are obviously younger than that because the stirrup spacing was closer than what the code required. And we eventually found out that yes, indeed, these buildings were that old. It's just that the designer who had designed many of these buildings just felt uncomfortable with the stirrup spacing required by code and put in more stirrups than what was required at the time back, I think this was in the late 60s. And because of the decision of this one engineer, several buildings survived the first Christchurch earthquake. And that was such a lesson for me. Just because something is allowed in the code doesn't mean you have to do it. It's the minimum requirements. And so I'm suggesting that just put the stirrups in. We're talking, I don't know, it's just handfuls of dollars to put those stirrups in. And if anything changes, so, you know, what we're doing here is if you load a beam like that, what we're arguing about is that there's a range in here where the shear is low, so you don't need the stirrups. But what happens if you install some heavy piece of equipment or a crane or something in the middle of that span, and then all of a sudden this shear diagram looks like this, and now there's a big shear where you don't have any stirrups. Anyway, if you want to, you are allowed to not put stirrups if you meet this requirement right here. Phi Vc over 2 greater than Vu. I'll get off my soapbox, and then in the next lecture, we'll talk about minimum stirrups and maximum spacing, which are different things.